Good evening and welcome to a Tenement Museum book talk. I'm Elizabeth Venditto for the Tenement Museum, and tonight I'm joined by Ilan Stavans, the co-editor of How Yiddish Changed America and America Changed Yiddish. He is the publisher of Restless Books and professor of humanities, Latin American and Latino culture at Amherst College. He's a recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, Chile's Presidential Medal, the International Latino Book Award, and the Jewish Book Award. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I wanted to start by giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about your work and your research in both Yiddish and in Spanish.
Great. It is an honor to be in this talk at the Tenement Museum. The Tenement Museum for me is not only an extraordinary institution, but a symbol of how we have to look at immigration historically in order to understand who we are in the present and where are we going and where we're going in the future. I am Mexican by birth, the grandchild of Eastern European Jews, Yiddish speakers, who escaped Poland, the Ukraine, Lithuania in different moments. Some of them wanted to come to the United States. Immigration quotas made it impossible. They were stationed, depending on the grandparent, in the Caribbean or in Central America, and finally made their way to Mexico. Yiddish was my first language, or my second first language. Spanish and Yiddish were the languages that I spoke as a little boy growing up in Mexico City. I went to Yiddish school up until high school. I learned Yiddish to read Sholem Aleichem and Peretz and Isaac Bashevis Zinger, but also we learned Mexican history and civics and geography in Yiddish. Mexico, Brazil, Canada, other parts of the Jewish diaspora kept Yiddish as a language of instruction, a language of identity, until rather recently, in contrast with the United States, where Yiddish was the language of immigration or arrival, and roughly within one generation, it was being put aside in order for English to become the language of home, of family, of the entrance to the mainstream. And that is why there is such a difference between the people of my parents' generation or my generation in other parts of the world and in the United States. Of course, the United States was one of the biggest magnet of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, maybe with next to Palestine, what eventually would become the State of Israel. I am a scholar of language, a scholar of identity and culture. I am very interested in how languages are born, how they developed, how they thrive, and I am interested in languages that have perished, that have died, languages in the Americas, in Latin America, where when the Spaniards first came in 1492, there were close to 6,000 languages, and now there are just a very few that survive. I am also a translator, a fiction writer, an editor, and mostly a teacher and a reader. I am always happy to stress that I have lived different periods of my life in different languages. The first period in Yiddish, the second in Spanish, the third in Hebrew, and this one in English. And I don't know. I think that if I had to tell my life, it would have to be told in that particular language, depending on the period. So languages play really a very central role in how I see the world, how I perceive the journey of individuals, and Yiddish has a particular place in my heart for the reasons that I was explaining.
Can you tell us a little bit about your education in Yiddish?
Yes, I spoke Yiddish. It was in some ways a private language. Spanish was the language of the street, of soccer, of the neighborhood. I lived in the southern part of Mexico, far from where the Jewish community lived, because my parents were rebels. My father was a prominent theater and soap opera actor. So Yiddish was for us a form of religion. We were not instructed to be Hasidim or Orthodox. For us, the sense of Jewishness came from the fact that we were the new chain, the new chapter in the history of Yiddish in its journey from 1,000 years ago to wherever the future was going to go. And it was a big responsibility for us to be able to speak this language. We were not only talking to our contemporaries in Yiddish, we knew, it was stressed time and again, that our ancestors had spoken that Yiddish, that language, Yiddish. That language is not only the words that you use to communicate with others, but it's the memory that the sentences, the force behind the books that were produced in that language is also. And so I say that it was a religion because we felt the responsibility of keeping Yiddish alive. It is one of the only languages in the history of humankind that has been targeted for destruction in such a systematic way in an abbreviated period of time. And so there was some kind of the survivor's guilt, you could say. It was deposited on us that Yiddish had to pass on to the next generation. It didn't in many ways. My nephews and nieces don't speak Yiddish. My children don't speak Yiddish. I am interested in Yiddish. Some of my students are interested in Yiddish, but Yiddish has had a more troubled journey than other languages. One last thing that I can tell you on this is when I was growing up in this small enclave in Mexico, Jewish, Mexico today has a population of about 125 million people, and the number of Jews is rather small, 40,000. Maybe not even that, 30,000. In other words, most Mexicans in Mexico will never come close to a person of Jewish faith or Jewish culture, in part, not only because of the number, but because the Jewish community keeps to itself, still in a kind of semi-isolated way. And all these things that I'm telling you about the responsibility of speaking Yiddish, the knowledge that it was a time capsule and that it needed to travel to the future with us as the conduit. It sounds beautiful, but for a little kid, it's a burden. And I rebelled, and so did many of my generation. And we often ask our parents why did they need to be so impractical? It would have been better, we would tell them, to learn French, to learn English, to learn Hebrew, the language that was already the national language of the state of Israel. Yiddish. Who would speak Yiddish when we would grow up? What would we use this language? What was the purpose? Could we let it die and live in the present tense instead of being so stuck, anchored in the past? It took me a while. I guess that is what aging does, growing up, to realize that it was an invaluable treasure that they had put in my hands, in my mind. But only after I left home, only after I journeyed away from Mexico and lived in other parts of the world, and finally settled in the United States, when I realized that Yiddish was emblematic of my education, but much larger than that. It was the language of a decisive chapter in Jewish history that could or could not continue depending on the future of the language in these new diasporas. And it was also something else, Liz. Jews have been engines of linguistic production. Because we have lived in so many different places, we have produced an incredible amount of languages. Yiddish, the mixing of German and Hebrew that also ended up incorporating other elements from Slavic languages, from French, from English, from Italian, etc. Ladino, the mixing of Spanish and Hebrew, Judo-Italian, Judo-Arabic, Judo-Farsi, Judo-Persian, Judo-Portuguese. Wherever the Jews have lived, because of the diasporic nature of our existence, we have engaged in code switching, in linguistic and lexicographic production. But of all those languages, the one, aside from Hebrew, that has been the most creative, the most proficient, the most enduring, has been Yiddish, but also perhaps the one that has had the most tragic chapters. And so Yiddish is many things, and maybe is the prism through which we can understand what Jewish life is today, what Jewish lives have been in the past, and what Jewish lives might or might not be in the future.
There are so many threads I'd love to follow up, but one thing that really strikes me is you talk about your education as a boy and about the responsibility to speak Yiddish and to preserve it. On the other hand, you say of all of the Jewish languages, Yiddish is one of the most enduring. Is there a paradox there, or is this a product of different moments in time?
You see, it's a paradox that needs to be deciphered, but it's impossible to fully understand. Look, Yiddish, the fact that Yiddish is around today, there are approximately 200,000 speakers of Yiddish in the world today, many of them Orthodox who live in the United States, who live in Israel and in other parts of the world. There are also secular Jews that use Yiddish. It is a language that has seen the darkness of the barracks and concentration camps, that has been pushed to gas chambers and ovens. The decimation of 6 million Eastern European Jews is also the destruction of the language that they spoke. And that language carries the DNA of those speakers. It is a language that knows tragedy. It is a language always on the verge of not being here anymore. But one of the reasons why I am so in love with Yiddish and why I think so many people are connected with it, it's because it's a language that resists. It's a language that endures. It's a language that will not allow others to say the last word for itself. It will do it on its own if it ever does. And whenever you get the impression that Yiddish is about to be erased from the face of the earth, something in it makes it come back. And somebody writes in it or about it. In many ways, Yiddish today is like Latin. Not many people speak Latin, but we have a certain nostalgia for the Latin poets, for the Roman Empire that gave forth all this extraordinary literature. The question is the real question is no language can survive out of nostalgia alone. Languages need speakers. Languages need a bank, need a post office, need a flag. Yiddish is a language without an address. It doesn't have those national grounding institutions that other languages have. Maybe that makes it so appealing to others, but when you have a language that is not grounded, you are much more vulnerable to the elements, to the forces of the environment. You don't have an army. Once a famous Yiddish linguist said that the difference between a slang or a jargon in a language is that a language has an army and a navy to defend it. And a jargon, for many years, Yiddish was just described as a jargon, doesn't have anybody to defend it. And it went to the gas chambers because it didn't have anybody to stand for it. But 70, 80 years later, here it is yet, and maybe ready to write another chapter.
So you've talked about your love of Yiddish. You've also talked about the responsibility and defending it. Do you feel like you fit anywhere on that spectrum? Is there a combination? Where does a book like this, where does a career like yours come from?
I don't have any messianic visions for myself. I simply love the language. I love the fact that it's a hybrid, that it's even before immigration, in the immigration to the United States, it was already a kind of contaminated, polluted, degraded language. And I use all these terms in a benign way because that's the way Yiddish was often referred to. It was the language of women, the language of children, the language of the illiterate. It started, there's a debate about it. It started maybe in the 9th century, maybe in the 11th century, next to the Rhine in Germany. At the very beginning, it was just a kind of code switching mechanism to go back and forth between speaking German and speaking Hebrew. But it took off. And at one point, women were writing children's stories or ABCs for their children in Yiddish. There began to be commentaries about the high holidays, about Purim, about Hanukkah in Yiddish. And before you knew it, in the 18th century, it started having its own literature. It was a literature that was considered illegitimate. It wasn't the literature of the Talmudic rabbis. In fact, the rabbinical establishment frequently looked down at Yiddish as unworthy. And it wasn't until the 19th century when a number of Hebrew writers decided that if they wanted to write novels that people would understand, they needed to write them in the language that people spoke. In Hebrew, could be for the future, could be for redemption, for survival, but Yiddish was the nuts and bolts. And many of them, Sholem Aleichem, the greatest of all Yiddish writers, in my opinion, the author of the Tevye, the milkman or the dairyman, on which Fiddler on the Roof was based, himself translated his early Hebrew language novels into Yiddish, just thinking that it was going to be an interesting experiment. And lo and behold, this became extraordinarily successful. Other writers were also beginning to write in Yiddish. And by the end of the 19th century, not only was there an extraordinary literature, a national literature, emerging in all these many national bastions in Lithuania, in Poland, in Hungary, in the Ukraine, etc. But there was also a sense that you needed to translate into Yiddish works from other languages, and it's one of the rare examples in Jewish history. We have Dickens in Yiddish, we have Spinoza in Yiddish, we have the Bible in Yiddish, we have Shakespeare in Yiddish. These were such voracious readers, the Eastern European Jews, that they didn't simply sit to wait for the next novel that one of their novelists was going to write. They wanted to read what was happening in the rest of Europe. And so Yiddish became the compass, became the anchor, became the home, became the trampoline for many of these Jews to know their own environment and to connect to the rest of the world. After the Second World War, Yiddish ceased to be a language of literature, ceased to be a language of transactions. But another major event happened in Jewish history, and that is the immigration that we're talking about, what the Tenement Museum represents. It is not a Holocaust, but it is an upheaval of cosmic proportions. And many descendants of Yiddish speakers now speak English or French or Spanish or Portuguese, and they have this have this sense that they wish they knew more Yiddish, but it's more a longing than anything else. So I tell people, look, with Yiddish you can discover not only the great aspects of the Jewish immigration to the United States, you can read Shakespeare. And the fact is that the translation into Yiddish of Hamlet says in the cover that it is translated and improved. This is, I think, the only translation that I know of Hamlet to any language where the translator had the chutzpah to think that he could improve on Shakespeare.
Who is that translator? I want to know. I really don't know how to top that. But I do have to ask about translation, because the book here, and I'd love for you to tell us more about it and how you and your co-editor selected the pieces. It is a book of Yiddish writing in English, or commentaries on Yiddish, English commentaries on Yiddish writing. Why?
This book celebrates the 40th anniversary of a wonderful institution, the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. I teach at Amherst College, and the Yiddish Book Center is literally 2 miles away from here. And it is a superb institution because it has gathered the books that many immigrants were getting rid of when they were dying, or their children didn't have use for, and put them all together in one place and turned this place into a research and educational entity. It sends the books all over the world. It translates the books. It creates all sorts of activities for young people, for students, for seniors to be able to reconnect with Yiddish. I wanted to do a book that celebrated this wonderful organization, and I wanted to do something more. Look, I've been in this country as a Mexican bocher, as a young Yiddish-speaking Mexican for more than 30 years. I am incredibly grateful to this country. It has been very generous to me. It opened its doors. It hasn't always been easy. But I realized when I settled in this country that what I had in common as a Mexican Jew with American Jews was that substrate, that base of Yiddish. My co-editor, Josh Lambert, is a Canadian Jew who also heard Yiddish he was less involved growing up with Yiddish than I am. And we talked and realized that in some ways we're sandwiching Mexico on the one hand, Canada on the other, the experience of American Jews. And as outsiders, we would like to present a kind of mirror up to nature, again, using an image from Shakespeare, to say, look, Yiddish has been an incredible tool, an incredible resource for American Jews. But are you, American Jews, aware of where is Yiddish now? What are you ready to do for it? And so we wanted to present poems, short stories, essays, recipes, humor pieces that have spanned the 120, 150 years of Jewish immigration. But the title doesn't only mean how Yiddish changed America, meaning the United States, and how America changed Yiddish, because there's also a section in the book about the other Americas: Cuba, Colombia, Canada, Mexico, Argentina. Yiddish also played a role there, and it has been a companion of immigration. And we wanted this book to be a testament of that transformation, and hopefully also an inspiring mechanism for the young to think where it could go in the future.
Now I'm curious, because of the 6 sections in the book, the final section is the one on Yiddish in the Americas outside the United States. Why is that? Why only that one section?
Because, demographically, the biggest the most impactful of all immigrations to the Americas, if we count them by numbers, is really in the United States. The United States was a magnet unlike any other Americas, including Argentina. Argentina was probably the second largest focus of immigration. There was a Yiddish theater in the 1920s to the 1950s, Yiddish press, Yiddish literature, but it never flourished in the way that American Yiddish did. In the United States, not only Yiddish became an all-purpose language, it also gave us a gift many words to the English language, much more than, say, Yiddish to the Spanish language or Yiddish to the French language. If you think of words like chutzpah or shmendrik or bagel or pipik or so many others, they are part of the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, or the Merriam-Webster. Yiddish has become a part of the lexicon of speaking English, and you don't have to be a Yiddish speaker to be able to use these words. The other day I was writing something and I looked for the word saftig, meaning wholesome. And I thought I will have to italicize it because it's a Yiddish word. And again, lo and behold, there it is in Merriam-Webster, spelled with a Z. I don't have to, it's very clear what it means. I remember when Al Gore, upon accepting the nomination to become vice president, used the words chutzpah in his acceptance speech. Not exactly a Yiddish boy from the Lower East Side, but the word chutzpah was perfectly suitable for what he was trying to say. And he was trying to obviously attract a particular portion of the electorate. So Yiddish is now universal. It is in English and it's in other languages. And it's a place of arrival and a place of departure, not only for Jews, but for anybody.
I have to ask about that because in the introduction of the book, you talk about Yiddish as a language that's fetishized by people who don't speak it. And I mentioned this to you earlier, but when I told people I was doing this talk about this subject, I had a lot of people who were so excited. I love Yiddish. It's so great. They're not Jewish. They don't speak it, or very few of them, I should say, were. And I'm in New York City, so we have a very diverse group of people.
The capital, sure.
We're excited. And I've never had another language people were, I would say, quite so excited about, but I don't think that was usually people would express enthusiasm.
It's wonderful. Yeah, it's wonderful. I want to react to what you said, but before I say that, before I react, I want to rescue something you mentioned, Liz. You know, very often when I speak on Yiddish or when I meet descendants of Yiddish speakers in the United States, they tell me something that always sounds similar, and I'm sure at some point somebody in the audience either will feel that this resonates or maybe share an idea that goes along these lines. They say that when they were growing up, Yiddish was the language that their parents or their grandparents used for them not to understand. When they switched to talking about marital problems or sexual issues or monetary challenges, they switched to Yiddish because they didn't want the kids to be able to follow. And I find this really puzzling. Language is supposed to be a mechanism for us to understand each other, for us to communicate. But this language was a way to exclude, to let others out. But in creating that sense of you won't understand what we're saying because this is forbidden, in that generation, there was the feeling that, oh, I want to know. If they are speaking in Yiddish, it must be something interesting. It must be something that will impact my life. And so I think that curiosity, that magic, that mystical aspect of Yiddish, in part is the result of the exclusion that the next generation was pushed to experience when their parents did not train them to speak Yiddish. Why do so many people connect with Yiddish? I think that the story of Yiddish is a story of endurance and survival. It's a story that now can be seen as neutral not politically charged. There are other Jewish languages, for instance, Hebrew, that is politically charged. Whatever reaction we have to the state of Israel, there are certain perceptions that Hebrew is connected with a certain approach to the Palestinians, a certain approach to the conflict, etc. Yiddish has that neutrality, that sense that it's not affecting anybody, and it only has a nice side. It's not colonial, it's not imperial, it's not controlling, and it's easy to fall in love with it. The moment it gets a flag and a government, we can start criticizing if it ever does, and we might not like it that much. It's in that sense, it's kind of a beautiful but beautifully artificial love.
Do you think it's because it hasn't, as you said, been the language of colonialism, of a nation that you can criticize, or how much of it is being a diaspora language? There are other diaspora languages, but there's something particular about Yiddish.
Yeah. You use the word nation. It's a very important one. Maybe I used it as well. Yiddish is the language of a nation, but it's not the language of a territory. It's not the language of a government. And it depends on how we define the Jewish people. We could define it as a culture, as a nation, as a religion, or something more abstract. Yiddish has the quality of having been able to manage different environments. It's a diasporic language. It has always coexisted with other languages. My grandmother on my father's side, when she arrived to Mexico, running away from pogroms, from anti-Semitism in Warsaw, in different parts of Poland, she swore never in her life to speak a Polish word again, in revenge for the emotion she was feeling for the country of her birth and the country that she had to run away from. But she had Yiddish. And with Yiddish, she fell in love with a Ukrainian Jew. And then she had in-laws that were Hungarians that spoke some Yiddish, and others that were from other parts of Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Belarus. Yiddish was a lingua franca of many Jews that lived in many different nations, that through Yiddish they could find each other. And there were different accents. There was the Lithuanian accent called Litvak, or the Galician accent in that portion that always changed in Poland, the Galicianer Yiddish. And whenever somebody started speaking, you could locate them by their accent, but you could also be able to understand enough to be able to relate to them. In many ways, it was a kind of a bridge across the different experiences that the Eastern European Jews had in the Pale of Settlement. It created a feeling of a community, of collectivity, of we're all one and the same. Yiddish was the language of superstition, of magic. It was also the language of storytelling. It was the language of theater. It was the language of songs, of klezmer music. It was the language of cuisine. It was incredibly rich in terms of vocabulary. And keep in mind, Liz, that is the time, the end of the 19th century, where the birth of nationalism took place. And at that time, there was another so-called neutral language, neutral diasporic language, actually created by a Yiddish speaker, and that was Esperanto. It was the language that was supposed to bring everybody together, to bring peace to the world, but it was never meant to be everybody's first language. It was always meant to be everybody's second language. So if you were a French speaker and spoke Esperanto, and a German speaker and spoke Esperanto, you would be able to communicate. Yiddish had that talent. Yiddish was the neutral language for many Eastern European Jews. That made them feel that if they didn't belong to the place, they belonged to the culture. And they carried the language with themselves to the Lower East Side, and from there beyond. And if it has an address at any point in the United States, it's where the Tenement Museum is. It's the Lower East Side. Those walls, those apartment buildings have been witnesses to the many language of immigration, including Yiddish. And whenever I visit, they resonate in beautiful ways. You can hear the noises in those staircases, in the way the doors and windows open. The Yiddish is right there creating that music.
And I have to ask you about the Yiddish of the Lower East Side. That's the first section of the book. First of all, how do you choose what pieces represent? Or maybe not, represent is the wrong word. Maybe you would just say, give you a taste. This is a smorgasbord of the Lower East. You have very different kinds of pieces in here. I immensely enjoy that section. So tell us, what is the Yiddish of the Lower East Side?
I'll tell you this. Whenever you put together an anthology, and I have done 2 or 3, you really are creating 2 books. You're creating the book with everything that went in, and the book with everything that is going to be left out. And the hope is that the book with everything that went in is better than the book with everything that was left out. So you have to trust your guts. You have to think of a variety of readers, and you have to place the pieces there to provoke, to entertain, to enlighten. The Lower East Side is such a fascinating small place where so much history has happened. It is where not only obviously Yiddish speakers came, but Italian speakers and Spanish speakers and so many others. It is a museum unto its own that is also a part of a living city. One of the aspects that I like the most about the Lower East Side today is that my ancestors, Yiddish speakers, are now replaced by my present compatriots, Spanish speakers. And I hear Spanglish in the streets that at one point witnessed Yiddish. And for me, Spanglish, that mixing of Spanish and English, is a kind of modern Yiddish. It's a mixed language. Intellectuals tend to look down at it as the language that it's a broken language. You can't really think full thoughts in it. But Spanglish is beautiful. Spanglish is already producing a literature that is going to have a lot to say. In just as Yiddish was able to produce a Nobel Prize winner in 1978, Isaac Bashevis Ziegler, that represents what that language was able to produce, I am convinced that in 10, 20, 30 years, a Spanglish writer will win the Nobel Prize, and his or her work will have to be translated into English or into Spanish to be read in the Lower East Side.
Bold prediction. Any votes for your Nobel Prize laureate?
I'll keep that. It's just, the person is just being bored right now.
I do want to ask, though, you're a great person to ask this question. What does your study of Spanglish inform of your understanding of Yiddish and vice versa? Because I feel like you're someone to get beyond the platitudes of, yes, language, people make meaning out of it, yes, but what specifically do they teach you about one another?
What they teach me, Liz, is that languages, just as languages die, and we cry when they die because they represent the end of memory of a particular community, languages are also born right before our eyes and ears. And if and then they are born, it's because there's a need for them. We might look down at Spanglish, but Spanglish is the result of necessity, of people who come to this country without a dictionary under their arm, without the pedigrees or degrees from ivory tower institutions, and yet they are the chroniclers, the real speakers that carry the culture ahead. Yiddish started as a mix. English started as a mix. French, Italian. Many of the languages that we use today and see as pure were very impure at the very beginning. And there was a reason for them. They were connected to a particular place, to a particular community. I see Spanglish as a language of almost 60 million people. It's extraordinary how many people speak Spanglish today. There are radio stations already in Spanglish. There are menus. The classified ads in many newspapers are in Spanglish. There's song, there's movies. I think Spanglish is the most interesting linguistic phenomenon that is happening this side of the Atlantic. And it is a testament to the emergence of a new civilization that is a mestizo civilization that is part Anglo, part Hispanic or Latino, but it's neither Anglo nor Latino. The way that Jews were not Hebrew speakers or German speakers, they were Yiddish speakers. And eventually they did something in that language that set the tone and the tune for everybody else to follow. I have learned enormously from Yiddish to appreciate, even to celebrate, the value of Spanglish, sometimes against the grain, because I think that that is where the real action is taking place right now. And just as in Yiddish, there are different types of Spanglish. There's the Nuyorican Spanglish, the Cubonics or Cuban American Spanglish, Dominicanish or Dominican American Spanglish, Tex-Mex or Pachuco or Chicano Spanglish. So various Spanglish speakers might meet and you will identify the accent, you will recognize most of the words, but there are a few that you will not understand. That's communication. That is the tension that exists in this new language that is emerging, that is very much like Yiddish.
At this point, I should remind the audience, we welcome your questions on Yiddish or in Spanglish. I think that's fair. Or a combination of both. I do want to ask you about, so you have an essay in the book on Leo Rustin's The Joys of Yiddish. And you talk about, you did a study in the 1990s of Spanglish and how they inform each other. So you could tell us a little bit more about that particular piece?
Yeah, I remember finding, Liz, when I had maybe 20 years into my American journey, coming from Mexico to the United States, I found this book called The Joys of Yiddish. I didn't know who the author was, Leo Rustin. Started looking at it, and I realized that it was a kind of humorous dictionary in English of many words from Yiddish that needed to be defined in a way that it wasn't for scholars, but for the general audience. And I absolutely fell in love with that artifact. I love dictionaries. I have a large collection of dictionaries. Dictionaries can be too stuffy and pretentious, and kind of the word from God. This is the way you should define the color yellow or the word money. But Rustin was doing something different. Rustin did not pretend to be a lexicographer. He wanted to do something that everybody already knew. He wanted to define the word schmaltz or schmendrick or schmegege or shiksa, words that everybody was listening to. He wanted to trace them down and then tell a joke about it. And he created this book that he was a novelist, more or less successful when he published this book. And this book became a runaway bestseller, not only among Yiddish speakers, former Yiddish speakers, but also among non-Yiddish speakers, the audience in general. And I think that that book is a statement of arrival for American Jews. The moment in which the language Yiddish had receded enough for people no longer to know how to spell the word meshugane in Yiddish, but recognizing the word meshugane in English and wanting to define it and laugh about it and maybe continue using it. So in many ways, that book, The Joys of Yiddish, I would say is a kind of predecessor for this one, How Yiddish Changed America and How America Changed Yiddish. It's a kind of very affectionate, very grateful statement of look at the journey that we have taken, how the words have come to represent us. When we use them, we are only the latest incarnation of speakers using these words. And it is our responsibility to put them in the mouths of the next generation. We don't have to do them always in the classroom or always with a kind of hammer on people's head. We can do it joyfully, humorously, in a way that it's just relaxed. And I like that very much. I like that. I think that dictionaries are the safeguards of the language, but I think there can be all sorts of dictionaries. And that was a lesson for me by Leo Rustin. And some years later, I decided to do the same and created the first dictionary of Spanglish, defining some of these words, explaining them to a large audience. It's a dictionary of Spanglish English. It was very controversial when it came out. I received death threats, a fatwa from the Royal Academy of the Spanish language saying that Spanglish should not be paid attention the way that Professor Stavans was doing. But 20 years later, Spanglish is alive and well, and the dictionary continues to be enjoyed by people. So Leo Rustin was my teacher in some ways.
Did you take his humorous approach to your dictionary?
I did. In some of the humor in the Spanglish dictionary is either direct, I mean, you can get the humor, but I also threw in secret jokes that only a few readers are able, and some of them are connected with the Joys of Yiddish.
Would you have done that approach without the Joys of Yiddish, you think?
No, I don't think I would have done the dictionary without the Joys of Yiddish. I think that he, in some ways, he gave me permission, and he gave me also the key of how to do it. And I never met him. I'm only a reader of his work, but I'm very grateful.
And I want to ask, when we talk about Yiddish, I think here in New York, but as well as reading the book, one thing that always comes up and connects to the language is Yiddish humor or Jewish humor, quote unquote. How would you define that? But why are they connected? Again, I can't think of necessarily of a language that's connected
that intimately with
yes.
humor. Yes.
Why?
Well, I think that given the history of tragedy of Eastern European Jews, they could either commit suicide or find a way to escape their condition by making a joke. And it was often said that in Poland, if there was a pogrom, a Jewish joke would have arrived faster than an ambulance. I think that Yiddish has the capacity, has the ethos and the pathos to convey the very difficult life of Eastern European Jews in a way that is affectionate and funny. There are many expressions in Yiddish that really you can't translate. For instance, there's an expression that if you dislike somebody very much, you will say, may he become very rich and use the money for doctors. Or you should hang like a lamp in a room. There is this humor in Yiddish that is cruel, sometimes vicious, but it's very Yiddish. It's a way to cope with the adversarial conditions that many of the Jews experienced at that time. Look, I think that French is a wonderful language to fall in love. I think that Yiddish is a terrific language for explicatives and to be funny. And I'm not surprised that so many Jewish comedians started in the United States. American Jewish comedians started in Yiddish. Mel Brooks and Jerry Seinfeld and Karl Steiner and so many others. Yiddish conveys that pathos, and it has been kind of carried over to the English language. Of course, there's nothing worse than to translate a joke from one language to another. When you translate it, you kill it. So you have to really know the language to get the juice of it all. But my grandparents were very funny when they told jokes in Yiddish, not very funny when they told jokes in Spanish.
I'm curious. So you talk about Yiddish and Yiddish language humor as part of this long history of violence, of suffering, but yet we don't associate other languages necessarily. At least I don't. With from a say like a refugee community, which is not a term you use, it's a term I'm using now, with that kind of humor. Do you think it's the length of that history, of that difficulty that really imbues Yiddish with something different than other languages?
No doubt, Liz. Yiddish is a language with 1,000-year history. When Yiddish started, the Canterbury Tales had not been written. Shakespeare had not been around. Napoleon. Yiddish precedes, Yiddish goes back to the Crusades. It is a language that has experienced false messiahs, expulsions, assassinations, false claims of blood libels, so much, and all of that is ingrained, is in the DNA of the language. And I think the humor connects with the particular circumstances of a speaker, but also with the suffering of those that came before, that finds its continuity in those speakers. I really want to stress this part. Whenever we use any word that I'm using right now, or that you are using right now, it could feel so transient, but the word transient itself is a word that is a time capsule that emerged at a particular point, that is the result of a juncture. And our predecessors have used that word in particular ways, and the word will survive us. Others will use that word, and we'll look at 2021 and say the word was used in this particular way at that time. So I think that it's important when we think of language to think of ourselves as a portion of a long journey. And Yiddish is a perfect kaleidoscope to see the scope of a civilization over a long period of time.
I'll have to think about that. But it strikes me, because you're talking about the scope of a long period of time, yet as you're talking, I'm feeling there's almost a sense of circular, at least in our conversation tonight, because talking about continuity, talking about responsibility. But something I noticed as I read through the pieces of the book, as well as the commentary, was the word assimilation kept coming up and up and up. Acculturation a little bit, but mostly assimilation. Not just in pieces about the early 20th century, where assimilation would be the dominant framework, people are understanding immigration in the United States, and assuming that Jewish immigrants should assimilate, or criticizing them for not quote unquote assimilating. But even in contemporary commentaries and some of the edited notes, this framework of assimilation.
Yeah.
Why? Why do you think that it might be?
It's a very interesting question, Liz. And at the core, I was reading recently for one of my classes, or rereading recently for one of my classes, a book by W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks, where he talks about the double consciousness that minorities have. They are insiders and they are also outsiders. He is talking about the Black community, the Black minority in the United States. But that dual position, being in and being out, or being inside and being outside, is a position that Jews have had over a long period of time, since the destruction of the Second Temple, since the destruction of the First Temple. But let's consider this the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 by the Romans. When a minority, the question is always, can a minority survive? And if a minority survives, does that mean that the status quo has failed to incorporate it, or that the minority has managed to integrate itself, but not too much, so that it doesn't lose its integrity, its continuity, its identity? That has been the dilemma at the heart of the Jewish diasporas. How do you become Jewish and German, or Jewish and Polish, or Jewish and Mexican, or Jewish and American? When have you gone too far? When have you assimilated too much? When are you no longer a Jew and only an American, or a German, or an Italian, or a Mexican? So the question of assimilation is a question that really is always palpitating in the many diasporas, and it's at the heart of Yiddish. Yiddish represents the rejection of assimilation by saying, we can speak German and be German like all other Germans, but we also speak Yiddish among ourselves. It's an internal language. We'll speak the external language with the others, but keep a certain integrity to ourselves. I am very conscious and conscientious about the word assimilation. I know about transculturation and acculturation, the other ones that you, as a scholar of immigration, often refer to in your own writing, as do many of your colleagues. In the case of the Jewish immigration to the United States, it's important to remember that the Jews had come from prior immigrations. So, for instance, when a Mexican comes to the United States and immigrates, comes from a country, but the Jew that came from Poland had arrived to Poland 2 or 3 generations before, and before Poland had arrived to Spain, and before Spain had arrived to Rome, and before Rome it had arrived to Babylon. The sense of being outsiders and insiders was always there. And so I think that what you're talking about is the thermometer of how I think that a democracy survives when its minorities are respected and play a role, but do not sacrifice too much in order to disappear. Where the mainstream or the status quo doesn't swallow everybody. And I think that in that sense, Yiddish is a good case study of how far we've come and where we need to go. Let me add one more element here. It is often said that the Jewish immigration to America is a successful immigration, and it is used as a case study. Look, within 3 generations, Yiddish disappeared, English became the dominant language, and from peddlers, Jews became lawyers and doctors and professors, etc. But the question, I think, connected with Yiddish now is, did it go too far? Did Jews assimilate too much? Did they give up too much of their ethnicity? Is there a desire among the younger generation to rescue something that was given up along the way in the effort to become Americans? And I see this on campus very often. My Jewish students have a certain envy of Black students, of Latino students, of Asian students. They want to see themselves again as a minority. And they want to connect with aspects of their ancestors like Yiddish in order to keep that sense of themselves as a minority group. And it remains to be seen how far that is going to go. Success is wonderful, but success has its drawbacks. And the question is, did Jewish American immigration become so successful that we assimilated to the point of disappearing? Or is there continuity? And I think that is the chapter that is being written now.
That's a thoughtful answer. I appreciate that. And I think it's our last answer of the program. So I think we're going to leave it to our audience to sit with that for a while. Is there anything else you'd like to say
I do.
about the book. Go for it.
I want to say that your questions have been terrific. I love the way that you have shaped them. I love the passion that you have brought to them, the knowledge, the way you've articulated them, and I want to thank you profusely for it.
It's deeply kind. Thank you. And I hope we're able to have you back soon for more conversations about Yiddish and Spanglish.
My pleasure.
We're going to sign off for now. Thank you so much for tuning in. This program is available to replay on YouTube, and we'll be joining you in, I believe, 2 weeks for another program. Thank you very much and good night.
A großen Dank. Shalom.